Europe at the dawn of the 19th century. An age of war balanced between the sword and the bomb, between the old world of chivalry and the new science of combat. Across the sprawling cliffs and breathtaking plains of Europe, the fate of empires is decided in the space of minutes, not by kings, but by the thunderous charge of horsemen who carried the banner of freedom. This is the age of Napoleon's cavalry, a brotherhood of warriors who were, in every sense, the last great knights of Europe. They fought to the death at the sides of their brothers, atop their trusty steed, surrounded by smoke and steel armor, and beneath a fluttering plume helmet, and of course, God himself. These men were unmatched in honor, fulfilled in their duty, and living an adventure unlike any other before or since. They were athletic, disciplined, stylish, brilliant, ruthless, and likely insane. They were devilishly mischievous, ungodly lucky, dangerously flirtatious, and supremely confident. They were the best of the best, and their horses were bred to match. They were killers and courtiers, the murderous gentlemen of high society, brutal in combat, yet bound by a righteous, unspoken code. In an age of cannons and gunpowder, they carried with them the romance and terror of medieval legend, sharpened by the precision and discipline of modern warfare. These were not merely soldiers. They were scouts, raiders, messengers, and executioners of Napoleon's will. They could appear suddenly on the horizon like a glittering storm, crash into the enemy's line, and be gone before the smoke cleared. Their speed was unmatched, their discipline terrifying, and their courage the stuff of legend. To see them in full parade was to witness a moving tapestry. Helmets glinting like molten gold in the sun, banners snapping in the wind, the drumming cadence of thousands of hooves. To face them in battle was something else entirely. A wall of horse flesh and steel bearing down, the air thick with the roar of the charge, the ground shaking beneath you until every instinct screamed to run. These were the men Napoleon called his thunderbolts, and he wielded them with the same precision a master swordsman uses to strike a killing blow. In the next hour, we will ride with them, into the snow at Eylau, up the bloody pass at Somosierra, through the fire and smoke of Waterloo. We will meet their leaders, their enemies, and the horses that carry them through history. This is not just the story of an arm of the military. This is a story of courage, pageantry, brutality, and elegance. This is the story of the cavalry and the Napoleonic Wars, the last true knights of Europe. Cavalry in Napoleonic warfare. On the battlefields of Napoleonic Europe, the cavalry were more than just a weapon. They were the scalpel, the hammer, and the vanguard of the army. To Napoleon, cavalry were not just support troops. They were the instruments of his decision-making. They were the force that could turn a stalemate into a crushing victory or a retreat into a routed disaster for the enemy. Their role was multifaceted, and their value lay as much in their speed and flexibility as in their raw striking power. First and foremost, they were the eyes of the Grande Armée. Long before the battle began, light cavalry units like the hussars and chasseurs à cheval were sent ahead, fanning out across the countryside to find the enemy. They moved fast and lived off the land, their keen eyes scanning for dust clouds on the horizon, their ears tuned for the distant clatter of wagons. It was the cavalry who brought Napoleon the intelligence that he needed to strike: an enemy's location, the condition of their troops, and the weakness of their line. They were also the screen. Cavalry covered Napoleon's movements, riding in a thin, restless line between his army and the enemy's scouts. Behind this living curtain, entire troops could shift position without the foe knowing until it was too late. Many of Napoleon's most famous surprise maneuvers, such as his encircling marches, were possible only because the cavalry masked his intentions until the decisive moment. And then came their most feared role: shock action. At the right moment, often when the enemy line was faltering but not yet broken, Napoleon would unleash his heavy cavalry. This was the killing blow, the moment when armored cuirassiers or dragoons thundered forward in tight formation, sabers down, to smash into the wavering foe. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Men who might hold the line against infantry fire would crumble and run when faced with a wall of charging horsemen. When victory was achieved, the cavalry became a hand of pursuit. Infantry might claim the field, but it was the cavalry who ensured the victory was complete. They hunted down the fleeing soldiers, scattering them into the countryside, capturing baggage trains, and preventing the enemy from regrouping. Without this pursuit, many of Napoleon's battles might have ended merely as tactical success instead of decisive triumphs. Even in defeat, the cavalry played their part, serving as the shield of retreat. In the chaos of withdrawal, they would form rearguards, riding repeated delaying actions to buy precious time for the infantry and artillery to fall back. Many a French army owed its survival to these desperate rearward charges. Napoleon himself understood their value perfectly. Without cavalry, he declared, battles are without result. He treated them not as mere accessories to his infantry and artillery, but as an equal arm of decision. And under his command, they proved again and again that in the right hands, cavalry could be the decisive factor in a modern battle, even in an age increasingly ruled by gunpowder. The cavalry's role was never static. In one battle, they might serve as elusive shadows, harassing the enemy's flanks and masking the emperor's plans. In another, they would appear like a thunderstorm on the horizon, crashing down a single devastating blow and sweeping the field clean. They were not simply an arm of the army. They were the soul of maneuver warfare. Types of cavalry. Napoleon's cavalry was not just a single weapon, but an entire arsenal, each honed for a different purpose, each with its own style, spirit, and role in battle. The cuirassiers. These were the heavyweights of Napoleonic cavalry. The cuirassiers were heavy cavalry units who could be most closely compared to the mounted armored knights of old Europe. Named after their steel breastplates, the cuirass, the cuirassiers were giant men covered in armor head to toe, riding the largest, most powerful horses in the army. Their mission was simple and brutal: break the enemy with pure shock. When a cuirassier regiment lowered its sabers and came on at a full gallop, the ground shook as though an earthquake had struck. They were not subtle. They were the mailed fist of the emperor. In the smoke and chaos of battle, their polished armor made them look like moving statues, implacable and unstoppable. Their equipment sometimes weighed over 100 pounds. The armor protected them from musket fire at range, giving them the nerve to close in. For the soldier in their path, they were a wall of steel and muscle, nearly impossible to stop. The carabiners. Cousins to the cuirassiers, the carabiners were light, heavy cavalry armed with saber and carbine, which was a handheld type of an early, large pistol. They were the first cavalrymen to be armed with firearms. The carabiners began the wars in bearskin caps and blue coats, but later they reemerged in tall brass helmets and crested in red breastplates of shining metal. They were the elite of the heavy cavalry, often chosen for their size and strength. Napoleon often combined his cuirassiers and carabiners in a cavalry reserve to be used at the decisive moment of battle. They were not only a battlefield weapon, but also a spectacle. The sight of a line of carabiners thundering forward was as terrifying as it was magnificent. If the cuirassiers were a hammer, the carabiners were a gold-plated one. The dragoons. Dragoons were originally a class of mounted infantry who used horses for mobility but dismounted to fight on foot. From the early 17th century onward, dragoons were increasingly also employed as conventional cavalry. They trained for combat with swords and firearms. Dragoons were the most versatile cavalry arm. They fought both mounted and on foot, could charge like heavy cavalry, and also dismount to seize and hold the ground like infantry. Their green coats, crested helmets, and adaptability made them the perfect tool for an unpredictable battlefield. They could be used as shock troops one day and as scouts and rear guards the next. This flexibility earned them the nickname the chameleons among soldiers. The hussars. If the cuirassiers were statues of war, the hussars were dancers, flamboyant, fearless, and fast. Wearing braided dolmans, tight breeches with gold and silver stripes, and fur-trimmed pelisses strung jauntily over one shoulder, they were as much of a parade as they were a fighting force. Instead of being chosen for their size and strength, the hussars were often chosen for their incredible wits, cunning, small stature, and agility on horseback. They rode smaller horses than the rest of the cavalry and very little to no armor. But beneath the style was a deadly purpose. Hussars were the masters of reconnaissance, pursuit, and raiding. They struck quickly, disappeared just as fast, and made life miserable for any army foolish enough to leave its supply lines unguarded. They lived by daring and audacity, and the greatest of them, like General Lasalle, became legends for their exploits. The chasseurs à cheval. Often called the workhorses of the light cavalry, the chasseurs à cheval were steady, reliable, and always in the right place at the right time. Clad in green with light braids, they lacked the hussars' flash but made up for it with discipline and endurance. Napoleon kept a regiment of chasseurs in his imperial guard as his personal escort, a sign of their trustworthiness and loyalty. If the hussars were the showmen, the chasseurs were the quiet professionals. The lancers. Armed with long wooden lances tipped in steel and adorned with brightly colored pennons, the lancers were a terror on the battlefield. Their weapons gave them reach over swords, allowing them to strike before an opponent could close in. The most famous of all were the Polish lancers, whose charge at Somosierra in 1808 broke through 4 lines of defended artillery in minutes. With their distinctive square-topped chapka helmets, they could be seen from far away, a sight that sent chills down the spines of their enemies. The Mamelukes. Exotic and formidable, the Mamelukes were drawn from warriors Napoleon had encountered in Egypt in the late 1790s. These Islamic North African horse warriors followed him back to Europe and supported his empire for the next 2 decades. They wore flowing robes, silk sashes, and turbans, carrying curved sabers and pistols. Though small in number, they were ferociously skilled in close combat and served in Napoleon's imperial guard as a living reminder of his eastern campaigns. Their presence on the battlefield was as symbolic as it was practical, a statement that Napoleon's reach extended beyond Europe itself. Together, these distinct types of cavalry formed a complete mounted arsenal. Heavy cavalry like the cuirassiers and carabiners delivered the crushing blow. Dragoons adapted to any role. Light cavalry, hussars, chasseurs, lancers, scouted and harassed and pursued. The Mamelukes added a dash of fearsome unpredictability. Napoleon wielded his cavalry like a painter uses colors, blending them in different combinations for each campaign. And when used together, they became something greater than the sum of their parts, the thunder and lightning of the Grande Armée. Culture and lifestyle, the brotherhood of the saddle. Napoleon's cavalry was a fraternity, culture, and lifestyle both on and off the battlefield. This brotherhood of men shared close bonds, traditions, ways of life, and mentalities, whether they were on campaign or at home. Cavalrymen lived in close-knit, regimental communities. Squadrons ate together, drilled together, and shared the same routes. A trooper might ride into battle knowing the man on either side of him had been beside him on the march for years. This closeness bred fierce loyalty, not just to Napoleon or France, but to one's regiment and immediate comrades. Captain Jean Roche-Quanet of the Guard recalled, "We share everything, bread, wine, and hardships alike. In the cavalry, a man could not live for himself alone. He lived with and for his comrades." Marbeau, another famous memoirist, remembered how, even in hunger, there was not a man among us who, after cutting a piece of meat, did not at once offer half to the comrade at his side. Our fraternity was stronger than hunger. This bond carried into battle. One Polish lancer wrote after Somosierra, "The pass was won not by sabers, but by the hearts of comrades who would not let each other fall." Another veteran put it more simply. A man could die alone in the infantry. In the cavalry, he was never alone. Symbols of pride. Every regiment had its own colors, music, and traditions. The pelisset tossed over one shoulder, the gleaming cuirass polished, the braid on a hussar's dolman. These weren't just uniforms, they were statements. A man's appearance reflected his pride in his unit. Hussars in particular became notorious for their dashing style and flamboyant dress, cultivating an image of fearless gallantry. Marshal Joachim Murat himself, the most flamboyant of cavalrymen, staged elaborate banquets on campaign where he forced officers to dine in full plumes and sashes, even in the mud. It was completely absurd, but it gave the men pride and reinforced the image that cavalry lived not only for war, but for style. Many cavalrymen even carried keepsakes given by their comrades. A plume, a spur, or a scrap, or a braid. To lose one was dishonorable. To keep it was to carry a fragment of the regiment's spirit. Music, song, and storytelling. In camp, music was everywhere. Regimental bands played marches and fanfares, but the troopers themselves sang around the fire. Songs about lost sweethearts, daring raids, or mocking rival regiments. Storytelling passed down the exploits of famous charges until they became regimental legend. For infantry regiments, successful maneuvers and victorious engagements were often witnessed by many, occurring in the densely packed heart of great battles. For the cavalry, however, daring escapades and accomplishments were often only witnessed by few, if by any at all, because they occurred on the outskirts of these great engagements. The honorable actions of these men became legends through word of mouth, which gradually evolved from tales and stories told around a fire into patriotic anthems chanted by entire regiments on the march. Baron de Ségur recalled in the Russian campaign, "Around the fire at night, our laughter drowned the howling of wolves. We were freezing and starving, but so long as one bottle passed from hand to hand, we were rich." Even in disaster, the songs and laughter kept the men bound together. Regiments developed little rituals of their own. Lucky charms carried into battle, toasts before campaigns, games of skill with sabers and lances. Among hussars, the infamous toast of the saber saw wine poured down a blade and drunk at its tip. New recruits might be baptized with a dousing of brandy and a rowdy welcome into the family. Rivalries between regiments were constant. Hussars mocked the cuirassiers for being slow and clumsy. Cuirassiers mocked the hussars for caring more about their braids and boots than about the fighting itself. But beneath the jokes lay deep respect. For when one order came to charge, rivalries vanished and squadrons rode out as one. Rations were basic: bread, salted meat, and wine when it could be found, but cavalrymen adapted to the lands that they marched through. In Spain, they learned to cook with olive oil. In Germany, they bartered for beer and sausages. Sometimes hunger forced more creative solutions. One tale tells of a hussar who stole a goose from a farmhouse. Instead of punishing him, his captain made him roast it and share it with the squadron, a lesson that no man ate alone. Officers' messes were more elaborate, places where gossip, pride, and tactics mixed freely with fine wine. Murat's grand banquets, staged amid the mud of a campaign, were legendary. They struck the men as half absurd, half magnificent, but they also reinforced a sense of belonging to something greater than mere soldiers' rations. For cavalrymen, even their horse was a trusted partner. Men spoke to their mounts, fed them treats, and swore they could sense each other's moods. Some even toasted their horse with wine before drinking themselves. Colonel de Brac later wrote, "A cavalryman without his horse is only half a man. A horse without his rider is nothing. Together they form a living weapon, and the squadron is its soul." The bond was tested in battle. At Somosierra, one lancer recalled, "When my comrade fell wounded, I dragged him across my horse's back. He clung to the mane as if it were my hand. We never abandoned our own, not even under fire." Cavalrymen did not only ride across battlefields, they also moved with ease in the salons and ballrooms of Europe. The uniform itself was a passport to high society. A hussar's braid and pelisse, or a cuirassier's gleaming breastplate, carried a glamour that infantrymen could rarely match. In garrison towns, cavalry officers were often courted guests of aristocratic families, invited to balls and salons where their charm, daring, and uniforms made them the center of attention. Womanizing was part of the cavalry reputation. Hussars in particular cultivated the image of reckless lovers, men who rode fast, drank hard, and courted boldly. One French officer equipped that the hussar conquers as much with his smile as with his saber. Many memoirs speak of fleeting romances with local women during campaigns, or scandalous affairs carried on with noble patrons while regiments were stationed near cities. Parties and celebrations were frequent. A regiment might erupt into nights of dancing, drinking, and laughter after victory, with officers supplying wine and musicians for the revelry. Even on campaign, officers like Murat staged extravagant feasts to impress both his comrades and the local elite. For young cavalrymen, this life of gallantry and excess was as much a part of their identity as the charge itself. But this glamour came at a cost. The cavalry's reputations for extravagance sometimes bred resentment among infantrymen, who saw them as arrogant or spoiled. Yet to the public, and especially to the women of the salons, the cavalry remained symbols of romance and daring, men who belonged equally to the battlefield as to the ballroom. When off duty, gambling was a favorite pastime. Card games and dice rolled away many troopers' pay. Some men played recklessly, others only for amusement. Between campaigns in towns and cities, cavalrymen flocked to taverns, theaters, and dances, often appearing in full uniform to oppress the locals. The culture of leisure was another bond, risky, rowdy, and full of swagger, but it reinforced the cavalryman's identity as both soldier and gentleman adventurer alike. A cavalryman's life blended refinement and hardship. The same officer might waltz in a ballroom one week and sleep under the stars the next. They were soldiers, but also performers, playing roles of gallantry that bolstered morale and pride. Marbeau summed it up in one of his most famous lines. The hussar was born to fight and to laugh, to ride fast, drink hard, and die young in the company of friends. The saying went, "Any hussar who isn't dead by 30 is a blackguard." That mixture of bravado and fraternity, of hardship endured together and swagger worn like a uniform, gave Napoleon's cavalry a culture as distinctive as its thunderous charges on the battlefield. Weapons and equipment. The Napoleonic cavalryman was a fusion of man, beast, and steel, a weapon in motion. Every piece of his gear, from the crest on his helmet to the nails in his horse's shoes, was chosen to serve in the chaos of battle. These were more than just riders. They were moving arsenals, carrying on their horse nearly everything they needed for both survival and combat. Unlike infantry, who could rely on baggage trains or supply wagons, a trooper often had to live out of his saddle. Strapped to the horse were not only his saber, pistols, or carbine, but also a bedroll, cloak, and sometimes even rations for days of marching. His mount was his lifeline, carrying food, forage, ammunition, and spare gear, while also serving as the very weapon of shock in battle. Every piece of his equipment, from the curve of a hussar's light saber to the gleaming cuirass of a heavy cavalryman, was chosen to balance speed, striking power, and protection. The cavalryman's kit had to make him self-sufficient on campaign and deadly in the charge. Much like a modern-day climber, every pound of weight was carefully considered. Each piece of kit served one of two purposes: keeping him alive or making him deadly to the enemy. The following were his most important tools. The saber. The true signature weapon of Napoleon's cavalry was the saber. Its curved blade was designed for slashing attacks at speed, delivering deep, sweeping cuts from horseback. Heavy cavalry, like the cuirassiers, carried long, straight-bladed sabers for thrusting into enemy ranks. But light cavalry preferred lighter, more curved versions that allowed for faster cuts in the whirl of a melee. A skilled cavalryman could draw, slash, and return his saber in a single fluid motion. In battle, the glitter of hundreds of blades catching the sunlight as they came down in unison was as much of a weapon of terror as the steel itself. The lance. The Polish lancers made the lance a feared sight on European battlefields once more. These lances were much like the weapons medieval knights used to joust. At over 9 feet long, it could strike an opponent before he was close enough to swing a sword. In the first moments of a charge, the lancers could sweep through the infantry and cavalry alike, breaking formations and sowing panic. The fluttering pennons near the spearhead weren't just decoration. They distracted the enemy horses and helped identify the regiment. The pistol and carbine. Most cavalry carried pistol and saddle holsters, heavy single-shot weapons used in the instant before the impact or swirling of chaos in a melee. Dragoons and some light cavalry carried carbines, shorter than the infantry muskets but accurate enough to deliver a volley before charging or when skirmishing on foot. Though gunfire from horseback was never as decisive as cold steel, it could soften an enemy line or scatter pickets before a charge. Armor. For the heavy cavalry, the cuirass was both a badge and protection, a breastplate and backplate of steel designed to turn a saber cut and sometimes even deflect a musket ball. Helmets were made of brass or steel, often with flowing horseshoe crests that gave the rider extra height and presence. These armored cavalrymen were the modern evolution of medieval knights. Light cavalry dispensed with the heavy armor to preserve speed, relying instead on agility and horsemanship for survival. The saddle and horse gear. A cavalryman's saddle was more than just a seat. It was a combat platform. Designed to keep the rider secure during sudden turns, leaps, and collisions, it distributed weight evenly across the horse's back. Stirrups allowed the rider to stand and strike downward with maximum force. Every strap, buckle, and pouch had its place. Saddlebags for rations, holsters for pistols, a carbine sling, and sometimes a rolled greatcoat strapped across the pommel. The jingle of his gear was the constant music of a cavalry camp. For all cavalrymen, however, the horse was their true weapon. No matter how fine the saber or how bright the cuirass, a cavalryman was nothing without his horse. Horses were chosen for their speed, stamina, and temperament. Heavy cavalry mounts were tall and muscular, capable of carrying a man in full armor into the press of a melee, while light cavalry favored faster, more agile breeds for scouting and pursuit. In battle, horse and rider became one. A well-trained mount could respond to knee pressure and weight shifts alone, leaving the rider's hands free for weapons. Many cavalrymen formed deep bonds with their horses, bonds that could mean life or death in the chaos of combat. Due to their large size and fragile physique, horses were often lost to gunfire or injury during combat. A cavalryman was considered extremely lucky to be able to keep his same horse throughout his years of service. There are many romantic stories told by cavalrymen of their steeds protecting them in life or death situations. Individually, each piece of a cavalryman's equipment was impressive. Together, they were devastating, a mounted platform of speed, steel, and human skill. Napoleon's genius lay in knowing exactly how to unleash this combination for maximum effect, so that when his cavalry struck, they did so with all the force and precision of a master's blade. Uniforms and appearance. Before a single charge was sounded, before a saber left its scabbard, Napoleon's cavalry created a decisive maneuver with their appearance alone. On campaign, they were warriors. On parade, they were a living tapestry that represented the military strength and pride of the empire. The uniforms of Napoleon's cavalry made a dramatic statement and a psychological impact. An enemy who saw these riders gleaming on the horizon was meant to feel a chill down their spine before a single shot was fired. The heavy cavalry. The cuirassiers were unmistakable. Tall feather plumes rose above their tall, gleaming steel helmets, with black horsehair trailing behind. Their burnished cuirass covered their torsos and were polished until they reflected the sunlight and blinded the eye. Their coats were decked in metallic rope, and their boots and gauntlets were made of thick leather. They were the embodiment of martial power, a wall of shining steel on massive black horses. Their cousins, the carabiners, after their early campaigns, took on an even more striking look. White coats trimmed in sky blue, brass helmets topped with a flowing mohawk of red dyed horsehair, and gilded cuirasses that shone like molten gold. Bits of fine silver and gold adorned their every button and buckle. The heavy cavalry were gods on the parade grounds and beasts in the field. The light cavalry. If the heavy cavalry were statues of war, the light cavalry were walking painted masterpieces. Their tight dolman jackets were heavy with gold or silver braids, their pelisses and jacket popping with fur trims, slung rakishly over one shoulder, and their breeches piped in bright colors. Tall, braided boots hugged the knee, and their shakos spouted plumes or pom-poms in regimental colors. Hussar officers often competed in flamboyance, adding personal touches. Extra rows of braid, silk sashes, jeweled saber hilts. General Lasalle, the archetype of the hussar, was known to ride into battle with his pelisse thrown back to show his elegance even in the heat of combat. The chasseurs of cheval were less flamboyant but still striking, in deep green jackets with light braid and polished helmets of shakos. Their style was one of understated elegance, practical, yet still unmistakably imperial. The Polish lancers wore their distinctive chapka helmets, a square-topped cap with a high front plate, in bright regimental colors, often crimson and blue. Their tunics were tight and smartly cut, their boots high, and their lances topped with the fluttering pennants of red and white. At full gallop, these pennants streamed behind them like flames, giving the impression of speed even before the charge began. And then there were the Mamelukes of the Imperial Guard, warriors from Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, or Frenchmen dressed in their style. They wore flowing silk sashes, embroidered waistcoats, wide trousers, and curved sabers. Their turbans and scarves brought the colors of the East into the fields of Europe, making them look as if they had stepped out in a Arabian tale. It was not uncommon to see ranking officers or even marshals of the cavalry create their own unique additions to their uniforms or lavishly decorate their horses. Marshal Joachim Murat was famous for riding around with an entire striped tiger skin as his saddle, complete with the head of the animal facing behind his back with an open jaw full of fierce teeth. No description of Napoleonic cavalry uniforms would be complete without the mention of their banners and standards, the fluttering emblems that embodied the honor of each regiment. Each cavalry regiment carried an eagle standard, bestowed by Napoleon himself, often accompanied by richly embroidered silk banners in the regiment's colors. These were not just markers on the battlefield, they were sacred objects. To lose one was a disgrace, while to seize an enemy's was the height of glory. Cavalry standards were designed in the same flair as their uniforms. Heavy fringes of gold and silver thread, the names of hard-fought victories and battles embroidered along the fabric, and of course, the glinting bronze eagle mounted atop the pole. In the chaos of smoke and charge, these banners acted as a rallying point, guiding the squadrons forward and keeping formations together. Officers and troopers alike swore oaths of loyalty to their eagle, and men would fight to their deaths to defend it. Napoleon understood their power. At the Champ de Mars in 1804, he personally presented the eagles to his regiments in a grand ceremony before thousands of soldiers, declaring, "I entrust you to these eagles. You will always see them where your emperor considers them necessary for the defense of his throne and of his people. You will swear to sacrifice your lives to defend them." For the cavalry, this was not just pageantry. It was a vow of loyalty sealed in front of the emperor and the nation. That oath was tested on countless battlefields. At Waterloo, French cavalry repeatedly hurled themselves against Allied squares under a hail of musket fire. And even when whole squadrons were cut down, survivors would close ranks around their eagle to keep it from falling into enemy hands. The sight of a battered, bloody standard still waving above a shattered regiment spoke louder than words. As long as the banner flew, the unit survived. For cavalrymen, already among the most visible and flamboyant figures in Napoleon's armies, the banner added another layer of spectacle and pride. Just as a hussar's braided dolman or a cuirassier's gleaming breastplate caught the eye, the regimental colors waving above the horsemen turned their advance into something both terrifying and majestic, a symbol of the emperor's power charging across Europe. The purpose behind the splendor. These uniforms were not just vanity, they were psychological weapons. On parade, they announced power and unity. On the battlefield, the bright colors and plumes made it easier for men to follow their leaders through the smoke and confusion. Even the most flamboyant hussar braid had a purpose, to display regimental identity so that a trooper could find his comrades at a glance. Napoleon understood that the war was as much about morale as muskets. A splendid cavalryman inspired confidence in his comrades and unease in his enemies. When Murat led a charge in his gold-embroidered coat and streaming white plumes, it wasn't fashion, it was a declaration. We are unstoppable, and we will ride you down.